Today's book is Learning One-to-One by Ingrid Wisniewska. Apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong. This is part of the Cambridge Handbook for Language Teachers, edited by Scott Thornberry, published, I believe, in 2010. As you can see, the version I have is a photocopied version. This was part of my school library. This is quite common in Southeast Asia to just photocopy books for better or for worse. Well, actually for worse, meaning apparently it comes with a CD-ROM in the original version, which I don't think I'm missing out on any content in terms of theory or practice, because I think the CD-ROM just contains printable copies of the various worksheets which are in here. Although, I don't know. I mean, I don't have the CD-ROM, so to a certain extent I don't know what I'm missing, but the indications from the book are that all the printables are on the CD-ROM. Anyways, this book was in the discard pile of my school library. I picked it up years ago and was meaning to read it. Well, you know, I've always got a million books I'm meaning to read, but I recently picked up a new private student. And so I wanted to read this book to get some better theory for how to teach students one-to-one, because up until now, my practice of teaching private students, when I do have them, is very unorganized. You know, stuff thrown together at the last minute, asking the student what they want to talk about, just, yeah, not professional. And I wanted to be more professional about it. So I got this book. I started reading this book. Ugh. So, yeah, the book is divided into two parts. The first part is theory, and that's the first 5 chapters up to about page 100. The next part after that is just sample activities, and it's divided into different categories. So there's sample activities for conversation partner, you know, the teacher as conversation partner. There's sample activities for the teacher as observer and listener, as feedback provider, as mentor and guide, and as learner. Now, all these categories are a little bit vague, but they are defined in chapter 2 of this book, Teacher's Roles, where it talks about the various roles that the teacher has. Right. I found this book useful. It didn't blow me away. It didn't completely change my world. I think the big takeaway from this book is that you need to approach a one-to-one student just like you would any other class, and do a needs analysis, maybe do a diagnostic test, and try to devise a curriculum which fits the student's needs. And that's the big thing. And that's what I have not been doing all these years, is just kind of sitting down and trying to map out a curriculum. Now one point they make out over and over again in the book, and I think this is especially true with a private student, is you can't just make a curriculum and then it's set in stone. You're constantly getting feedback from the student, and you're constantly adjusting your curriculum based on the feedback you get from the student. I think that would be true even in a large class, but it's especially true in a one-to-one class. So, you know, you make a rough draft of what you think the curriculum is going to be, but each week you're constantly fine-tuning it. In that respect, I think this book really, to have a lot of value, needs to be supplemented by a good book on curriculum design. I was just coming out of Delta Module 3, so I can recommend Designing Language Courses, A Guide for Teachers by Kathleen Graves, book I've also reviewed on this channel. But I think that book, I think to get the maximum benefit out of this book, it helps to have some supplementary work on curriculum design. And again, you would approach a one-to-one learner just like you would approach a class. You would treat that one-to-one learner as if they were a class and make a curriculum for them. That being said, this does have a lot of useful suggestions on how you can adapt these practices for a one-to-one student. And for that reason, I'd say this is useful, but maybe not essential. I think what's essential maybe would be a good book on curriculum design. And again, the Kathleen Graves book I mentioned, I was quite happy with that. So, right, digging in a little bit more to the details of this book. Yeah, Chapter 2 talks about teacher roles, in which the issue of learning styles comes up a bit. Now, yes, if you follow the trends in ESL or ELT, you know that learning styles was quite popular 10 years ago, and now we've taken an abrupt turn and it's completely out of favor now. And if you don't follow the trends, I guess it's fallen out of favor because people have decided that it's not actually scientifically accurate to talk about learning styles. These were theories that had been advanced with little or no science behind them. They had been trendy and widely popular in the field, and then once the backlash turned against them, now they've fallen out of favor, and now on most training courses, they don't want you to talk about learning styles. And in fact, sometimes in my experience, the trainers will even correct participants if participants try and talk about learning styles. So with that in mind, the parts on the learning styles in this book have, I guess, aged rather poorly. And that has been a rather abrupt turnaround in just only 10 years. But yeah, she does go heavy into the learning styles here, talking about the framework of multiple intelligences by Howard Gardner, and talking about adapting these multiple intelligences to different activities in the classroom, which I think is something Howard Gardner himself is even a little bit leery of. And then she goes into neuro-linguistic programming, which, again, to be fair, I think was trendy in this field for a time, but I don't know, listen to what she writes about this. She says, another way to observe learning styles is through insights offered by neuro-linguistic programming. One example is to interpret your student's learning style by observing their eye movements. Looking upwards and to the right, for example, is said to indicate use of visual imagination. Upwards and to the left is said to indicate imaginative recall. Now, to my opinion, that is some out and left field pseudoscience right there. I mean, that's, I don't know. Neuro-linguistic programming was popular in the field for a period of time. So, yeah, you do have to keep that in mind, but I don't know. I feel like even given these trends, this seems to be a little bit out there. And yeah, again, it's something that pops up repeatedly in the book, is stuff about learning styles, and neuro-linguistic programming pops up not a few times. That being said, though, there are some elements of reasonableness in here. When she's talking about learning styles, when she first introduces it, what does she say? Sorry, I've got this marked here. She says, every learner brings with them a history of successful and unsuccessful learning. They will be used to certain methods of learning and teaching, and therefore deal with them well, but will find other methods difficult or unfamiliar. Now that's the first sentences she uses to introduce a section on learning styles. And that's fair enough. I think that's completely reasonable before you go out into left fields talking about what students' eye movements indicate. So it starts out reasonable enough. And then again, to her credit, she does acknowledge that some of the studies go against learning styles. For example, on page 30, she said, one study of learners in an academic writing context suggested that although students' stated preference was for correction of grammar errors, they actually spent more time looking at tutors' comments on the content and ideas in their work. So she doesn't connect the dots as fully as she could have, but to her credit, I think she does include that reference to that study, which is, one of the problems with learning styles is if you actually do scientific studies of it, quite often what the students say their learning preference is and what they actually benefit from can be completely different. Okay, moving on from that. She talks about there's a lot of stuff in here about one-to-one students. Talks about asking for feedback regularly. She talks about needs analysis and course design, in which she includes several sample needs analyses. There are many different types here because she's giving you many different options with many different styles. When I was using this book to get ideas for my own student, I just took a bunch of things from different sheets she had. So for example, she's got 3.3 here, Desired Student Outcomes Questionnaire, and 3.4 Learning Styles Questionnaire. Well, I left the Learning Styles one alone, of course. And 3.5, Your Job Questionnaire. 3.6, Your Interest Questionnaire. So I cherry-picked bits and pieces from the different questionnaires she had on here, which I think is what you're meant to do, and that worked fairly well in my case. Then she gets into, there's some stuff in here like collaborative lesson planning, where the student takes the initiative for directing the teacher towards what they're interested or how they'd like to plan the lesson. In my context, and I don't know, this could be a little bit cultural here in Southeast Asia, the students are very reluctant to do this. But, maybe in a different context that might work better. I don't know. She talks about selecting and adapting material, and there's some good stuff in here. She's got, talking about authentic material you can use, or just any material, I guess. She gives an example of how you can evaluate material and see if it's appropriate for the student. So this is another one of those worksheets you can print out where there's a whole bunch of criteria like, why did I choose a material? Is it relevant to my students' goals? What is my purpose in using this material? Will most of the vocabulary be familiar? Is it culturally appropriate? It gives an example of a teacher who's filled this all in before deciding to use a certain article with their student. And I cannot imagine taking the trouble to write all that down when I'm deciding whether or not to use an article. I mean, lesson planning takes up more than enough time without doing all these pre-things before you even select your material. It's not a bad idea to be asking these questions subconsciously, although I think maybe a lot of teachers do that anyways. When she talks about selecting and adapting course books, she does have some good ideas. I thought particularly her ideas on the grammar were quite good. They're obvious in retrospect, but at least in my experience, sometimes I miss some of the obvious things. You just don't think about it sometimes when you're planning lessons. So it's good to be reminded of it. So she talks about things like, you're doing a grammar point and you're working through the controlled practice exercises in a book. And she talks about changing the question, having the students make alternative endings to the sentence, have them make true sentences that are true for them using the same context of the sentence, turning the sentences into questions, and then getting the students to answer it. So, just more drilling practice and transformation practice. And that's just for like a gap fill control practice grammar exercise. She also has ideas for reading and speaking exercises, listening exercises, how you can adapt that. And then, some feedback and reflection forms. And again, this goes back to what she was saying about how it's important to get the learners feedback regularly. Although you don't want to just ask them, did you like the lesson? because that's a rather awkward question for them to answer, and if they're a little bit too honest, that could be a rather awkward answer for the teacher to get. So she talks about some ways around that, some other suggested questions that can maybe tease out what the learner found useful, and again, forms that are on the CD-ROM, or otherwise you can just adapt from the book. Yeah, sorry, jumping back a little bit, she talks about the various roles of the teacher in the classroom, which she divides into, the observer and listener, conversation partner, feedback provider, mentor and guide, and learner. And then each of those is put into a separate section where she suggests activities. I had some reservations about her idea as a teacher as mentor and guide. For example, she talks about how you want to guide the students. So, quoting from the book, she says, thinking of ways to encourage your student and help them to feel a sense of progress and success is part of the job. To facilitate this process, you may choose to include some activities that focus on developing learner strategies, as well as on the language itself. It's a good idea in theory. The problem I have with a lot of this advice is I think too often teachers who have a background with the CELTA, which is a background in maybe classroom management and setting up activities in the classroom, they're not experts on study skills, they're not experts on learning strategies, they're not experts on second language acquisition. A teacher's area of expertise is setting up classroom activities, especially in the ESL field where entry-level qualification is a CELTA in most cases. So I'm wary of moving too quickly to where the teacher is like a mentor and guide and telling the students how to study, what to study. I don't know, maybe in different contexts, or maybe with different teachers that they have a much stronger background with study skills and how to study independently. Certainly in my context, I'm very wary of when teachers assume the role of expert in second language acquisition. So that's my reservation about that section. Okay, she then moves on. The book moves on, and each of these sections that she outlines earlier is a series of activities. So for example, conversation partner. She's got a whole series of suggested activities that you could do with your student. Now, anytime you read a series of suggested activities, it's really hit and miss, isn't it? I mean, this is true for everyone, right? So I'm reading this and I'm thinking, okay, that'll never work. That's a good idea, but it's way too advanced for my student. Now, I don't have the resources to do that one. That one won't work because we're doing this as a distance learning on the computer. Oh, that one's quite good. Like for every 10 of these activities, one of them is actually suitable for your context. Or something like that. And that's how I felt when I was reading through these. Some good ideas in here, some not so good ideas as well. Only a handful of which would work in my context. And I think, your context may be different than mine, but I think the ratio is going to be roughly the same. Only a handful of these activities are going to work in any given context. Which, I don't know, makes it feel a little bit, makes me wonder if the space could have been used a little bit better, maybe more general suggestions or more theory about teaching one-to-one. But presumably she said everything she wanted to say in the first 100 pages. Now, because I've got a certain personality and because I like to read a book from cover to cover and really read it from cover to cover before I do a review here on this YouTube channel, I read this section cover to cover, but boy, it was so boring. To be fair, I don't think you're meant to just start at the beginning and read through it. I think you're meant to kind of flip through it and find the activities that appeal to you, or, you know, you're like, okay, I've got a lesson coming up on Thursday. Which one of these activities would work for my student, and flip through it. Reading it through, I don't know. It's this whole second half of the book. So about 100 pages. Now, granted, these aren't big pages, but 100 pages of just one activity after another. Near the end of this, especially, I did feel like I was really having trouble concentrating on this. You know, you get to the end of the page and you're like, oh, I was not paying attention to any of those activities I just read on this page. Okay, back to the top and start again. I slogged my way through it. In the end, I'm not sure how much of this I hold in active memory, but flipping through it, I am beginning to be reminded of it. Yeah. Some more learning styles and neuro-linguistic programming in here. Most of it fairly harmless. One or two activities strikes me as a little bit out there. For example, your earliest memory, the student describes the earliest memory to you. You make note of the keywords, and then you're supposed to decide if they're visual or auditory or kinesthetic. And yeah, smell, taste. So I don't know. Yeah, some of this neuro-linguistic programming, learning style stuff does infiltrate the suggested activities, but on the other hand, not all of the suggested activities. There are plenty of these which strike me as very solid, although, yeah, again, a number of them wouldn't work in my context. So to sum up, I think this book is definitely useful. It didn't completely rock my world. Well, actually, maybe I'm not giving this book enough credit. To its credit, I think this book helped me realize that I need to approach one-to-one learner just like I would any other curriculum. That clued me into the fact that I needed to use other books like Teachers as Course Designers by Kathleen Graves. So yeah, in that respect, I guess maybe it did have a little bit of an impact on my teaching. Yeah. So to sum up, I guess if you have a one-to-one student, I'd recommend this book. It's not the best thing in the world, but there are some useful ideas in it.